All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about how to find the lowest common denominator when you're working with fractions. Okay, so so far when we've worked with fractions, we've multiplied, we've divided, we've simplified, and all of those things, really all we're really trying to do is just simply cancel out common factors, things that are the same in the top and in the bottom. This is completely different. When we move into adding and subtracting, if you remember back to elementary school and when you learned how to add and subtract fractions, it's completely different than multiplying and dividing, and it requires you to have a common denominator. So in this video, we're going to talk about how do you do that with numbers, just a very, very fast review of what you already know from elementary school. But more importantly, and what's new for this video and for our class, is how do you do that with variables. All right, so with that said, let's take a look at the learning objectives and we'll get started. Only one learning objective, simply if you've got two fractions, find their common denominator. All right, that's all it is. So let's get started here. Let's just jump into something like we would have done back in elementary school, because this is a skill that we're still going to need. So suppose I want to take 1/2 and add 1/3. All right, to get a common denominator back in elementary school. Now you learned all kinds of shortcuts for this, probably depending on who your teacher was. Some of you can look at this and just do it in your head, but you really have two options. And when it comes to working with options, both of these options are still fine if you're working with numbers. So when it comes to working with numbers, both of these options are fine. One option is you simply multiply the two numbers together. In this case, that's exactly what we want for our common denominator. We would do 2 times 3, we would get 6, and that's it. That's going to be my common denominator. Okay, so that's the first idea. That's our first option. But another option is to find multiples. Find multiples. And so what we would do is we would take our two numbers and we would start making a list of this number times all of the various different integers. So I do 2 times 1, which is 2, 2 times 2, which is 4, 2 times 3, which is 6, 2 times 4, 2 times 5, 2 times 6, and so on and so forth. And then I would do the exact same thing with the 3. 3 times 1, 3 times 2, 3 times 3, 3 times 4, 3 times 5, and I would keep going with the 3. Okay, now we know that you can multiply forever. Those lists would go forever. So how do you know when you're good? How do you know when you stop? You stop as soon as you find a number that's in both lists. The first number that's in both lists, that's your answer. Now in this particular problem, the two numbers turn out to be exactly the same, right? But if I tweak the problem slightly, let's say that I want to add an 1/8 to a 12th, an 1/8 to a 12th. Well, if I do option number one, I would do 8 times 12, and I'm not sure what that is. I'm going to need to grab my calculator. It's going to be a big number. 8 times 12, and I get 96. Okay, so if I did that option, I'd get 96. The second option, making my list of factors, 8 and 12, 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2, 8 times 3, 8 times 4, and then so on and so forth and such and such. With 12, 12 times 1, 12 times 2, 12 times 3, and so on and so forth and such. But there's the first number that's in both lists. So I get that. Okay, so let's talk about this for just a second. Notice that I've got two different answers here. So this becomes the first thing that we want to be aware of. Option number one, what this option does is it finds a common denominator, but it's not necessarily the smallest. Not always the smallest. Okay, so that's not a very great option. This option works out better. Option number 2, this option always finds the lowest common denominator. I'm going to abbreviate it LCD, lowest common denominator. Okay. Now, our goal, we said, was that's what we wanted to find. We want to find the lowest common denominator. Now, why is that? Because if I add together two fractions and I use the lowest common denominator, then I probably am not going to need to simplify my answer when I'm done. Some problems you still will, but it's rare. Okay. With option number one, if I use just any random denominator, I'm always going to need to find the simplified version when I'm done. Okay. Now, when we're working with common denominators in our class, there will be times where you will need to work with numbers. And as far as numbers go, if you want to use something like this, we will let you. But know that you're making the problem harder for yourself because eventually you're going to have to simplify. Okay. If you find the lowest common denominator, then you know that you're going to be good. One side note, I'm not going to do it right now for this particular video, maybe in the example video or something else we can talk about it. But one side note, your graphing calculator can also find the lowest common denominator for you. So you can just type in a 2 and a 3 to your calculator. And if you know how to type it in correctly, it'll tell you 6. Or you can type in 8 and 12 and your calculator can tell you 24. Okay. So this becomes the two ways that you probably would have done it back in elementary school. When we're working with numbers, we're fine with both, but really this is what we're shooting for. This is what we're aiming for. Okay. But let's get into numbers. I'm sorry, that was numbers. Let's get into variables. Okay. So lowest common denominator with variables. For this, we need a third option. And the reason we need a third option is because when we're working with variables, if we end up with something that's bigger than we need, the problem can literally become impossibly complex. We can end up with something that's so difficult that we just can't solve it, okay? At least not with the skills that we will learn in our class this year. And if I do something like option number 2, the problem is when we're working with variables, well, I multiply by 1, 2, 3, that's fine. But do I also multiply by x squared, x cubed? Do I multiply by x plus 1, x plus 2, x plus 3? How do I know what to do when I'm working with variables? And so this becomes really impossible, option number 2, when I'm working with variables. So we need a third option. And here's the third option. We find factors, not common factors, just factors. Okay, so here's how this works. Suppose I've got 1 over x plus 2, and I am going to add that to 1 over, let's say 3x plus 6, something like that. Okay, so here's our example number 4. And example number 3. As a side note, like example number 1 and like example number 2, I'm not actually adding these, right? I'm couching this in the context of being an addition problem because that's what we're going to do in our next video. But I'm not actually adding them. All I'm doing is finding the lowest common denominator. So these are my directions. Example number 3, my directions would just simply say find the lowest common denominator. That's all I'm doing. So what I'm suggesting is the way that we can do that is by finding factors. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to factor both denominators. I'm going to factor both denominators. Now this one is already factored. There's nothing I can do. It has 2 terms. So I'm not going to use grouping or something like that. 2 terms with a plus sign. So the only real method I could use is greatest common factor, but a 1 and a 2, they don't have common factors. And x and something without x's, they don't have common factors. So this is already factored. So in this thing, my factorization is just x plus 2. That's it. That's my factorization. There's nothing I can do. In this one, though, I can do a greatest common factor, right? So again, I have 2 terms, but nothing is squared and it has a plus sign. So the only method that we've learned in our class so far would be a method of greatest common factor. So when I look at my numbers, both numbers can be divided by 3. They don't have common variables, so 3 is my greatest common factor. If I take 3x and divide by 3, I get an x plus, and then if I take 6 and divide by 3, I get a 2, so x plus 2. So here are my 2 factorizations. I've got an x plus 2, and I've got a 3 times x plus 2. Okay. Now, for my lowest common denominator, what we need is we need every number or every factor to be represented, okay? So basically, here's how I explain that. We need every factor to be represented. So since we need every factor to be represented, I just take the first one, all of it, okay? So use all factors from the first denominator. Okay, that's what I do. I use all the factors from my first denominator. So my lowest common denominator is going to have an x plus 2 in it. Okay, so I just take that whole thing, x plus 2. And then what I do is I add on to that, or I should probably say multiply onto that, any new factors from the second. Okay, so, and then I'm going to combine onto this using multiplication. So when I say add, I mean like combine them. I mean literally what we're going to be multiplying onto this, any new factors from the second denominator. Okay, so I already have an x plus 2. That's already there. I don't need that again. I just need the one that's new. Here's my new one. So I'm going to combine that on. So my lowest common denominator here would be 3 times x plus 2. That would be my lowest common denominator. Okay, so this becomes our basic procedure. Factor both denominators. Because we need every term or every factor to be represented, I'm just going to take all of them from the first one. And then I'm going to add to that anything that's new from the second one. Okay, so that's our basic procedure. The next video is just going to have several examples of how to use that procedure, but that's the basic procedure thing. And right now we're only finding lowest common denominators, right? So even though it says add, I don't actually ever add. That'll be our next lesson. What'll be coming in the next topic in the next set of videos. All right, so thanks for watching. Have a good one.